Hey everyone, I have a story to share, and trust me, this one's a bit wild. I never thought something like this could actually happen to me, but I'm living proof that the line between genius and insanity is razor thin. So, to give you some background, my name's James Carter. I've been a physicist for over a decade, mainly working on theoretical models of time travel. Nothing too groundbreaking, just the usual quantum physics mumbo-jumbo. But there was this nagging thought in the back of my mind. What if we could actually do it? What if time travel wasn't just a theoretical concept, but something I could actually bring to life? It started out small, late nights in my cluttered lab, surrounded by piles of papers, coffee cups, and broken gadgets. The walls of my lab in the city's outskirts were covered in white boards, each one scribbled with equations that never seemed to make sense until one night. Bam! It clicked. The theory of time travel, at least on paper, was possible. I don't know how I did it, but I finally figured out the equation, the key that would open the door to the past. I was high on excitement, maybe even a bit delusional. But after years of failed attempts, that night, in the dim glow of my desk lamp, it all made sense. I looked over at the strange contraption I'd been building for months, sitting there in the corner of the room. It was nothing fancy, just a large metallic box with wires sticking out of it, and a screen that flickered when you touched it, but it was my creation. My time machine. I didn't waste any time. The next morning I tested it. I won't bore you with the technical details, but let's just say it was a wild ride. I set the coordinates for a day in the past. Just a few days back, nothing crazy. Just to see if it was possible. The machine hummed to life. The air around me shifted, and suddenly, I was standing in the middle of my own living room. But it wasn't quite my living room. It was slightly different. A different version of it, if that makes sense. Like the air had been altered in some subtle way. I walked over to the kitchen. The counter was messy, more cluttered than usual, and there was a brand new coffee maker on the counter, one I'd never seen before. My heart raced as I realized I was standing in a parallel version of my own home. But it didn't hit me until I looked out the window. The city was different. It was brighter, cleaner, almost like it had been scrubbed of its usual grime. The roads were smoother, the people looked happier, and the sky had this unnatural shade of blue that felt almost too perfect. My mind raced. What had I done? I'd only been gone for a second, but this was a completely different version of my world. I panicked, rushed back to the machine, and hit the button to return to my original timeline. The machine whirred again, the world spun, and I was back in my lab. But when I checked my phone, the date was wrong. It wasn't the day I had left. It was a day earlier. The world around me felt off, like something was missing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something had changed. Something fundamental. And that's when the first signs of trouble started to show. My wife, Sarah, was the first to notice. When I walked into the house later that evening, expecting her to be sitting on the couch reading, she wasn't there. The place was completely silent. I checked every room. No Sara. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe she went out or was visiting a friend. But it didn't feel right. I felt like I was being watched, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. After an hour of frantic searching, I found her sitting on the steps of our front porch, staring off into space. When I called her name, she looked up at me with wide eyes, and for a second, I could see recognition. But then, her expression blanked, and she said something that shattered my heart. "Who are you?" I stood there, frozen on the porch steps, my heart pounding in my chest. The world around me seemed to blur. Did she just forget who I was? Sarah? I whispered, stepping closer to her, my voice shaky. "It's me, James. Your husband." She blinked, her eyes unfocused, like she was struggling to make sense of my face. Then she shook her head, a frown creeping across her face. "I'm sorry. I don't know you. I don't think I've ever seen you before." The air seemed to suck all the warmth out of the night, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to keep my voice steady, to not let the panic show. "What do you mean?" "Sarah, you're my wife. We've been married for 8 years. We have a daughter together." But she didn't react. She didn't remember me. It was as if I were a complete stranger to her. My mind raced. What was happening? Was this some kind of cruel joke? Had I somehow messed up the timeline so badly that it had altered everything? Everything? Was she even the same person? No, she had to be. She looked like Sarah. She had her eyes, her hair. That familiar way, she furrowed her brows when she was confused. But this was wrong. Deeply wrong. I think you should leave, she said, her voice suddenly cold, her eyes distant. I don't know why you're here, but you're making me uncomfortable. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. How could I explain this? How could I make her understand? But I realized there was nothing I could say. This wasn't my wife. Or maybe it was, but she didn't know me anymore. The thoughts that raced through my mind were dark. What if this wasn't just a memory lapse? What if I had irreparably changed the past in some way? The timeline wasn't just off. It was broken. I walked away from her, my legs heavy, my mind spiraling into panic. I went straight to the machine in the lab, hoping that going back to when everything was right would fix it. Maybe I could undo whatever I had done before it was too late. But when I got to the lab, it was already too late. Something had shifted in the room. The walls seemed to pulse, the hum of the machine louder than it had been before, like it was vibrating with some kind of foreign energy. I rushed to the controls, my fingers fumbling as I tried to dial back to the moment I first activated the machine. But nothing worked. The machine wasn't responding the way it should. Then I saw it. The screen flickered, and in place of the usual digital numbers was a blurry, distorted image. A face. A woman's face. Sarah's face. She was crying. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was reaching out to me through the screen, her lips moving, but no sound coming from her. I could see the desperation in her eyes, but the expression wasn't right. It was like a warped version of her, someone I didn't recognize, but also someone I knew too well. I reached out to touch the screen, but before I could make contact, the image blinked out. The machine powered down completely, the room falling into an eerie silence. I was left in the darkness of my lab, my hands trembling, sweat dripping down my forehead. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Was this a warning? Or had I really crossed a line I couldn't come back from? The worst part? I knew I had to try again. I had to go back, fix everything. But what if this time I couldn't make it right? I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face. That look of confusion, of not knowing who I was. It haunted me. I kept replaying everything that had happened, over and over, trying to make sense of it. But nothing added up. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The morning came, but it was no comfort. I couldn't get the image of Sarah's face out of my mind. I knew I had to fix this. I had to get the machine working again, go back, and undo whatever I had done to cause this mess. But how? I wasn't even sure where to start. I dragged myself into the lab, still groggy and shaking from exhaustion. The machine, once this beacon of hope and excitement, now looked like a foreign object, something that had caused everything to fall apart. I approached it cautiously, checking the wiring, hoping something had just malfunctioned, but everything was intact. I punched in the same coordinates as before, hoping I could return to that moment, before I had messed everything up. The machine hummed to life, and for a brief second, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I could fix it. Maybe I could bring Sarah back, bring everything back to the way it was. But when the machine powered down and I stepped out, everything was different. The air felt heavier. There was something off about the house, about the street, about the whole damn neighborhood. The trees outside were bare, even though it was still early summer. The people walking by didn't look like the usual faces I'd seen for years. They were strangers, and the strangest thing? They weren't acknowledging me. They weren't looking at me the way they used to, like I was invisible. I walked up to the door, half expecting Sarah to be there, sitting on the couch, reading, just like always. But when I opened the door, I was hit with the overwhelming smell of decay. It was musty, like something had rotted in the air. I hesitated, but pushed inside. The living room was empty. The couch was gone. The walls, once painted a soft cream, were now covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and torn in places. The pictures on the walls had vanished. I stepped deeper into the house. The kitchen was in worse shape, dishes piled high in the sink, food spilled on the counters. I felt a deep unease in my gut, but I kept searching, convinced that something, anything, would be familiar. But then I found it. There, in the corner of the hallway, was a dusty mirror. As I approached it, I hesitated. I don't know why, but I had a gut feeling that I wasn't going to like what I saw. When I looked into the mirror, I saw myself. But I didn't look right. My face was gaunt, hollowed out like I hadn't slept in days. My clothes were torn, my hands covered in dirt. And my eyes were wild, like I was losing myself. I didn't recognize the reflection. A cold, sinking feeling spread through my chest. I was no longer sure what was real. Was I really in my own house? Was this the same world I had left behind? The people walking on the street, the woman I thought was Sarah, they were all different, weren't they? They were wrong. Something was wrong with them. I had broken time. In my desperation to fix everything, I had only made it worse. I turned away from the mirror, my hands shaking, and I walked out into the street. The people around me still didn't seem to see me. Their eyes glazed over, staring into the distance. It felt like I was walking in a world that didn't even know I existed. I had to get to the bottom of this. I had to figure out what had happened, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I thought of Alex, a former colleague of mine, a brilliant mind when it came to quantum mechanics. He had always been the cautious one, the one who told me to slow down, to think about the consequences. Maybe, just maybe, he could help me make sense of all this. But when I got to his apartment, the lights were off. The door was slightly ajar. I knocked, but there was no answer. I pushed it open, feeling that dread creeping up again, the same suffocating feeling I'd had back in the house. Inside, the apartment was a mess. Papers strewn across the floor, books knocked over, half-empty coffee mugs everywhere. And then I saw it. On the desk, in the middle of the room, was a photograph of Alex. But it wasn't just any photograph. It was the same picture I'd seen before, a group photo from a conference we had attended together a few years ago. Only now, Alex wasn't in it. The picture had been altered. His face had been erased. That was it. The moment the realization hit me, I felt the ground beneath me shift. I wasn't just in a different version of my world. I was in a world that was erasing me, that I couldn't breathe. It was like the air around me had thickened, pushing down on my chest. That photograph, Alex's face gone, erased from existence, was like a punch to the gut. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hands trembling as I stared at the empty space where his image should have been. This wasn't just a timeline that was fractured. It was like I was being written out of the very fabric of reality. I stepped back, my mind spinning. I had to get out of there, get back to the machine. I needed to fix this, somehow, before I disappeared altogether. But as I turned to leave, the room around me began to distort. The walls shimmered like water, bending and twisting. I stumbled back in shock. Was I losing my mind? Was this what time travel had done to me? Driven me to madness? But I didn't have time to second-guess myself. I had to move, had to find a way to reverse whatever I had done before the whole world slipped through my fingers. When I got back to the lab, the machine was humming again, almost as if it were calling to me. But something felt wrong. It was like I was walking into a room I didn't belong in, a place that was never meant for me. I was aware of every inch of the space, the flickering lights, the dusty floor beneath my feet. The machine itself, usually a sharp, polished thing of metal and wires, looked like a relic now. Its glowing screen flickered erratically, the numbers on it scrambled beyond recognition. I approached it slowly, my breath shallow. There was no time to waste. I had to fix this now. I punched in the coordinates from before, the ones that had taken me back to that day, the moment when everything had first gone wrong. But the machine didn't respond. The screen went dark. And then, out of nowhere, it flickered to life again, displaying a strange message. Destabilization in process. Please stand by. I didn't understand. What did that even mean? My heart raced. Was the timeline collapsing? Was I out of time to fix everything? Suddenly, the air in the lab felt charged, like static electricity was running through it. The hum of the machine grew louder, and then bang. The ground shook beneath my feet, and the walls trembled as if the building itself were about to crumble. I grabbed the controls, trying desperately to get the machine to work, but it was like everything was slipping through my fingers. The buttons were unresponsive, the screen flashing wildly as though it were glitching out of existence. And then I saw it, her, Sarah. But it wasn't the Sarah I knew. It was a version of her, distorted, her face flickering in and out of focus on the screen. Her voice echoed in the lab, distorted and hollow, like a ghost. "James," she whispered, her voice crackling. "You can't fix it. You're too late." I froze, my blood running cold. Was this some kind of warning? Was this the end? My fingers hovered over the buttons, but I couldn't bring myself to touch them. Too late. What did that mean? Was there no way to fix this? Had I caused a break in time so severe that there was no going back? I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. My grip on reality was slipping, and I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't act soon. Suddenly, the door to the lab slammed open, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone who could help me, someone who could pull me back from the edge. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. The man who entered was tall, wearing a dark suit that seemed too perfect, too out of place in my cluttered lab. His face was cold, unreadable, his eyes sharp, like he could see right through me. He didn't say a word as he walked in, just stood there, watching me. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky. "What do you want?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the machine, his expression unreadable. "I think you know what's happening here, James." I swallowed hard. This man knew my name. He knew something I didn't. "What do you mean? What's going on? Why is everything changing?" The man stepped closer, his movements precise and deliberate. "You've destabilized the timeline," he said flatly. "The machine you created isn't just a tool for time travel. It's a ripple, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. Every time you travel back, you set off a chain reaction. And now you've broken it beyond repair." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I broke it. I shook my head, disbelief creeping into my chest. No, that's not possible. I can fix this. I can still go back and... "You can't," the man interrupted. His voice was softer now, almost pitying. "You've already done too much. The machine was never meant for someone like you. It's not just time you've tampered with. It's reality itself. And the more you try to fix it, the worse it gets." I stared at him, a cold, sinking feeling spreading through my chest. What was I supposed to do now? Was it really over? And then the man said something that made my blood run cold. "The world you knew, it's gone. There's nothing left to save." I couldn't breathe. The world was collapsing around me, and I didn't know how to stop it. The man's words hung in the air like a death sentence, and every part of me fought against the truth he had just dropped on me. The world I knew, it's gone. For a moment, I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to punch the wall, to do something, anything that would make this stop. But nothing I did would change the fact that I had broken everything. Time, reality, all of it had unraveled because of me. I looked at the machine again. It was still humming, still flickering with that eerie glow, but it was a mockery now. A cruel joke. I had built it with such hope, thinking I could control time, that I could play God. But it was bigger than me, far bigger. The man, whoever he was, watched me carefully, waiting for my next move. His presence felt suffocating, like I couldn't escape him. I knew, deep down, that he wasn't here to help me. He was here to watch everything burn. "Is there nothing I can do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away, and I hated him for it. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured, like he'd already accepted this fate. "You can't fix this, James. The timeline is already beyond your reach. The more you interfere, the more you'll destroy. The world you were trying to save doesn't exist anymore." I wanted to argue. I wanted to fight back, to demand that he give me a way out, but something in his eyes told me that this wasn't just some hypothetical problem. This was real. I wasn't just a victim of time travel gone wrong. I had created the destruction. But then something clicked. The part of my brain that had been firing on all cylinders trying to come up with a solution finally started to put the pieces together. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on me. I looked at the man, a strange calm overtaking me. "What if I let it go?" I asked, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. His expression didn't change. "Let it go," he repeated, almost mocking. "You can't just walk away from this. You can't erase what you've done." "No," I said a bit more firmly. "What if I stop trying to fix it? What if I let the timeline repair itself?" Maybe the only way out is to stop interfering, to stop existing in it. For a long moment, the man said nothing. I could feel his gaze boring into me, studying me like I was some kind of specimen, something to be analyzed and understood. But in his eyes, I saw something else, a glimmer of hope. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was there. "Are you really willing to let everything go?" he finally asked. "To accept that nothing you've known will ever be the same again? That you will never see the people you loved, the life you had, ever again?" I nodded slowly. I didn't have a choice anymore. The idea of trying to fix it again, of continuing to rip apart the fabric of time, was too much. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the lives of everyone else who had been affected by my actions. If I kept going, I was only going to make it worse. "I'm willing to let it go," I said quietly, my voice shaking. The man didn't say anything more. He just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the final step. Slowly, I turned toward the machine one last time. I reached out, touching the cold, metallic surface. And for a fleeting second, I thought I could feel the hum of the timeline itself beneath my fingers, alive, pulsing, waiting. And then, without another word, I pressed the button. The machine whined, its lights flickering, its hum escalating to a deafening crescendo. The room around me seemed to warp, the walls stretching, bending, and then everything snapped. I was falling, not through space, but through time itself. The feeling was disorienting, as though every part of me was being pulled in 1,000 directions. And then suddenly it all stopped. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my lab. The familiar surroundings were exactly as they had been before. The machine was still there, dormant, quiet. But something was different. There was no hum, no flicker of energy. The world was still. I looked around, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a deep sense of peace. My heart still ached, but it wasn't the same. It was as if I'd been given a second chance. The world was intact again. Everything was as it should be. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw Sarah. She was standing there, looking at me with a soft, puzzled expression. But this time, she wasn't confused. She knew me. She smiled, the same smile that had always melted my heart. "James," she said, her voice light and warm. "Are you okay?" I nodded, unable to speak. I reached out to her, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't fix the timeline. I didn't bring everything back to how it was. What I did was let go, accept that some things weren't meant to be fixed. The past was gone, and the future, well, it was still unwritten. But in that moment, with Sarah standing there beside me, I realized that maybe this was the way it was always supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. So, there it is. I hope you enjoyed the ride. It's been a crazy one for sure. Time travel sounds like a dream, but sometimes it's better to let the past stay where it belongs.